Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but as horizontal daggers of ice tearing across the Wyoming plains. Most folks would have frozen to death within an hour, huddled against the side of a dead tractor. Abigail Caldwell didn't freeze. Beneath 50 feet of compacted earth and rotted barnwood, she listened to the howling wind through a PVC ventilation pipe. She had spent 14 months digging in secret. Everyone in town thought she was crazy. They whispered about her behind the aisles at Donovan's grocery. But when the grid failed and the blizzard of 2008 buried the county alive, those whispers turned into desperate, agonizing screams. Abigail Caldwell was a woman built from the same hardened clay that made up the foundation of her late husband's failing farm. Oglala County was a place that did not forgive weakness, and Abigail had learned long ago to bury her vulnerabilities deep. When David died of a sudden aneurysm in the middle of the wheat harvest, he left her with 200 acres of barren land, a mountain of debt, and a dilapidated red barn that groaned every time the prairie wind picked up. But David had also left her a warning. He had been an amateur meteorologist, a man obsessed with sunspot cycles, shifting jet streams, and atmospheric anomalies. In his final months, he filled dozens of legal pads with erratic, frantic calculations. He predicted a convergence of atmospheric rivers and a stalled polar vortex that would create a winter event unparalleled in modern history. He called it the White Casket. Nobody listened to him. They called him a paranoid fool. After his funeral, Abigail sat at his oak desk reading through his notes until her eyes bled, tracing the terrifying math. David was erratic, but he was never wrong about the numbers. She decided to build, not a storm cellar, but a fortress. The digging began in late August. Abigail knew that if anyone in the nearby town of Bitter Creek saw what she was doing, the county would intervene. Permits would be required. Inspectors would pry. So she did the only thing she could. She worked entirely in the shadows. She cordoned off the interior of the massive 60 by 80-foot barn, claiming to the local feed store owner Wyatt Jenkins that she was converting it into a specialized greenhouse. Wyatt, a man whose nose was perpetually in other people's business, scoffed at the idea, but happily took her money for heavy-duty tarps and plywood. Abigail rented a compact Bobcat excavator from a supply yard 3 counties over, hauling it back in the dead of night beneath a canvas tarp. During the day, the farm was eerily quiet, but the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the barn became a site of relentless, back-breaking labor. She masked the sound of the diesel engine by running a loud ancient gas generator outside, telling the mail carrier she was experiencing electrical faults in the main house. For weeks it was just Abigail, the roar of the machinery, and the smell of raw, damp soil. The physical toll was immense. Blisters formed, popped, and hardened into yellow calluses. Her muscles ached with a deep burning lactic acid fatigue that kept her awake even when she collapsed into bed at 4 a.m. She excavated a massive pit 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 15 feet deep. The true logistical nightmare wasn't the digging. It was the dirt. Where does a lone woman hide hundreds of cubic yards of excavated earth without arousing suspicion? Abigail became creative. She began constructing elaborate, massive raised garden beds around the perimeter of her property. She posted flyers in town offering free topsoil, hauling it in the bed of her rusted Ford F-250 to anyone who asked. She even built a berm near the property line, claiming it was a windbreak for a future orchard. Every trip into town was a test of her acting abilities. At Higgins' Diner, she would sit with a cup of black coffee, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, forcing a polite smile as the locals gossiped. "You're looking awful thin, Abby," Sarah Higgins noted one Tuesday morning, pouring a refill. "And you got bags under your eyes big enough to carry groceries. What are you doing out there on that farm all by your lonesome?" "Just keeping busy, Sarah," Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her chest. "Spring cleaning came late this year." "Well, you be careful," muttered Billy Thatcher, a former farmhand who had been fired by David years ago for stealing copper wire. He sat 2 stools down, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Heard a lot of rumbling out your way last night. Sounded like heavy machinery. You ain't striking oil out there, are you?" Abigail forced a laugh. "Just the old generator, Billy. It's on its last legs." She left the diner quickly, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. She knew she was running out of time. The air was already beginning to crisp the leaves, turning a violent, desperate shade of orange. If David's calculations were correct, she had less than 3 months before the sky fell. The structural phase of the shelter was an engineering marvel born of sheer desperation. Abigail ordered reinforced steel I-beam cinder blocks and hundreds of bags of quick rete, having them delivered to an abandoned lot off Highway 9 before ferrying them to her farm in the dead of night. She lined the dirt walls with thick vapor barriers, poured a 12-inch concrete foundation, and reinforced the ceiling with steel decking, supported by heavy timber columns to bear the massive weight of the earth in the barn above. It wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a self-sustaining ecosystem. She installed a military-grade air filtration system, tapping it into the barn's existing cupola for discreet ventilation. She drilled a secondary shallow sandpoint well directly through the floor of the bunker, ensuring a clean water supply that wouldn't freeze. The entrance was a feat of mechanical ingenuity, a half-ton steel hatch concealed perfectly beneath a false floor in an old horse stall. It opened silently via a hydraulic pump powered by a hidden 12-volt marine battery. By the end of October, the shelter was complete, heavily stocked with MREs, canned goods, medical supplies, and enough propane to run a catalytic heater for 2 years. But the psychological toll was beginning to fracture her mind. She started having nightmares of being buried alive, of the steel beams buckling, of the earth swallowing her whole. Yet every morning she woke up, looked at the frost clinging to the window panes, and knew she had done the right thing. November arrived, not with a gentle autumn breeze, but with a biting, bitter wind that smelled like iron and ozone. The town of Bitter Creek was busy preparing for the annual Harvest Festival, completely oblivious to the meteorological anomaly brewing off the Pacific coast. Abigail had sealed the bunker entrance covering the horse stall with fresh hay and rusty farming implements. Above ground, she lived a minimalist existence in the farmhouse, keeping her bags packed and her eyes glued to the barometer on her porch. The pressure was dropping steadily, a slow, terrifying descent that mirrored David's frantic notes. The paranoia, however, was becoming impossible to manage. Every passing truck, every rustle of dry leaves sent her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fears materialized one bleak Thursday afternoon when a White County vehicle pulled down her long gravel driveway. Out stepped Richard Klein, the county building inspector. He was a sharp-featured man with a clipboard and a reputation for enforcing minor code violations with malicious glee. Abigail met him on the porch, her jaw set tight. "Afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell," Klein said, adjusting his glasses. "Mind if I have a look around?" "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Klein?" Abigail asked, gripping the wooden porch rail to hide her shaking hands. "Just a routine check. Had some reports of unpermitted construction out this way. Large deliveries of concrete and steel." He looked past her, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the raised garden beds and the windbreak berm. "You've moved a lot of dirt, Abigail." "Landscaping," she replied coldly. "I wasn't aware planting rhododendrons required a county permit." Klein chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "It doesn't. But modifying a commercial agricultural structure does. Mind if we take a peek inside the barn?" Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. The entrance was hidden, yes, but the barn was empty. Too empty. The massive pile of tools, the strange layout, a trained eye might notice the slight elevation change where the false floor sat. "I don't have the keys on me," Abigail lied smoothly. "Lost them in the tall grass yesterday. I'll need to have a locksmith out." Klein's smile vanished. "Mrs. Caldwell, I don't need a key. I have the authority to request immediate access. If you refuse, I can come back tomorrow with Sheriff Donovan and a warrant." Abigail weighed her options. Refusing him would only confirm his suspicions. "Wait here," she muttered. She went inside, retrieved a heavy brass key from a hook in the kitchen, and walked out to the barn, Klein trailing close behind. She unlocked the heavy wooden doors and pulled them open. The interior of the barn was dim, smelling of old hay, motor oil, and dust. Abigail had purposefully cluttered the space over the trap door with an old broken-down riding mower, several stacked pallets of rotting fertilizer, and an intimidating tangle of barbed wire. Klein walked in his boots, echoing hollowly on the concrete. He shined a flashlight into the rafters, then down along the walls. "No greenhouse," he noted dryly. "I ran out of money," Abigail said, playing the part of the destitute widow perfectly. "The bank wouldn't extend my line of credit. The supplies you heard about, I sold them to a contractor up in Rapid City to keep the lights on." Klein walked slowly toward the back of the barn, his flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. He approached the old horse stall. Abigail held her breath. If he stepped into the stall, if he noticed the seams in the concrete where the steel hatch rested, he stopped kicking at a loose piece of gravel. "Shame about David," Klein said suddenly, not looking at her. "He was a strange guy, always talking about the sky falling. Seems like you've inherited a bit of his eccentricities hiding out here." "Grief makes people do strange things, Mr. Klein." Klein lingered for another agonizing minute before clicking his flashlight off. "Well, everything looks fine here. But if you decide to do any actual building, you call my office first. Understood?" "Understood." When Klein's truck finally disappeared down the highway, Abigail collapsed against the side of the barn, gasping for air. The close call forced her hand. She couldn't wait any longer. She spent the next 48 hours systematically moving the last of her essential supplies from the house down into the bunker. She brought David's journals, a battery-powered radio, her winter gear, and a loaded 12-gauge Remington shotgun. She rigged a secondary deadbolt system on the inside of the bunker hatch. Once it was locked from the inside, it would require a plasma torch and days of labor to cut through from above. On the evening of November 12th, the radio broadcasts changed. The cheerful local DJs were replaced by serious, urgent voices from the emergency alert system. A massive, unprecedented low-pressure system was colliding with a freak moisture plume from the Gulf. They were calling for snow, but the models were breaking. The meteorologists sounded confused, then panicked. Abigail stood on her porch looking up at the sky. It wasn't gray. It was a sickly, bruised purple. The air was completely still. Not a single bird chirped. The silence was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Then the temperature dropped. It didn't drop gradually. It plummeted. Within 30 minutes, the thermometer on her porch went from 45 degrees to 0. The moisture in the air flash froze, creating a bizarre, sparkling diamond dust that hung suspended in the atmosphere. The white casket had arrived. It started with a sound like a freight train roaring through the valley. The wind hit the farmhouse with such force that the windows bowed inward, the glass groaning under the pressure. Then came the snow. It was a blinding, impenetrable wall of white. Within 2 hours, the power grid across Oglala County collapsed entirely. The lights flickered, surged brightly for a terrifying second, and then died, plunging the world into a freezing, howling darkness. Abigail was already in the barn. She had secured the heavy double doors from the inside, wedging thick wooden beams across them to reinforce them against the wind. She activated the hydraulic lift, pulling the old riding mower and the pallets out of the way. The steel hatch hissed as it opened, revealing the warm yellow glow of the LED lights inside her subterranean fortress. She climbed down the heavy steel ladder, the metallic clangs echoing in the pristine, quiet space. Once at the bottom, she hit the remote switch. Above her, the massive steel hatch slowly lowered. With a heavy, definitive thud, it locked into place. She engaged the interior deadbolts. 4 heavy steel rods shot into the concrete-reinforced frame. She was sealed in. Down here, the roaring of the blizzard was reduced to a dull, low vibration like a distant heartbeat. The air was clean, cycling through the HEPA filters. The catalytic heater hummed, keeping the temperature at a comfortable 65 degrees. Abigail sat on her military cot, staring up at the concrete ceiling, surrounded by her neatly organized supplies. She had survived the onset. Now she just had to wait. Above ground, the situation escalated into an apocalyptic nightmare. The temperature plummeted to -40 degrees. The snow fell at a rate of 5 inches an hour. Roads became impassable within minutes. Cars were buried where they stalled. In Bitter Creek, people huddled in their homes as the frost crept up the inside of their walls. Pipes burst. Roofs began to collapse under the immense weight of the snow. Days bled into weeks. Abigail kept a meticulous routine to maintain her sanity. She exercised, read David's journals, and listened to the battery-powered shortwave radio. For the first few days, there were frantic distress calls, maydays from truckers stranded on the interstate, terrified pleas from amateur ham radio operators. Sheriff Donovan's voice broke through the static on day 3. "This is County Dispatch. We cannot reach you. Emergency services are suspended. Stay indoors. Burn whatever you have to stay warm. God help us." By day 10, the radio went entirely dead, just an endless sea of static. Abigail marked the days on the concrete wall with a piece of chalk. Day 15, day 20. The bunker performed flawlessly. The solar panels she had discreetly mounted on the barn roof, camouflaged to look like patched tin, were mostly buried, but a small wind turbine she had rigged inside the barn cupola was catching enough of the ferocious drafts to keep the deep cycle batteries charged. On day 28, the monotony was broken. Abigail was reading a paperback novel when she felt it, a vibration. She paused, lowering the book, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. The dull hum of the storm was constant, but this was different. This was rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. She stood up slowly, her heart kicking into a sprint. It was coming from the hatch. Someone or something was striking the heavy steel door 50 feet above her beneath the frozen earth in the barn floor. She walked over to the ladder, holding her breath. The sound stopped. Maybe it was just settling ice. Maybe a beam in the barn had finally snapped and fallen on the false floor. Then, a metallic scraping sound echoed down the concrete shaft. Someone was trying to find a seam. Abigail moved silently to her supply rack, pulling the 12-gauge shotgun from its case and chambering a slug with a loud metallic clack. She climbed halfway up the ladder, stopping 10 feet below the hatch, listening intently. The scraping stopped. Then a muffled, desperate voice filtered down through the tiny gap around the locking mechanism. "Abby, I know you're down there." The voice was distorted, weak, but unmistakable. It was Billy Thatcher, the disgruntled ex-farmhand. "I saw the vents melting the snow on the roof." Billy's voice croaked, barely audible over the wind. "I know you built something. The whole town is dead, Abby. Everyone. It's just me. I'm freezing. Please, open the door." Abigail froze, her knuckles turning white around the grip of the shotgun. If she opened the door, she would let the freezing air in. Worse, she would let Billy in. A desperate, starving man who already hated her. In a survival situation, a man like Billy wasn't a guest. He was a parasite. He would consume her supplies, compromise her safety, and likely kill her for control of the bunker. "Abby, please!" The thumping resumed, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of heavy metal striking steel. He had a tool, a crowbar or a sledgehammer. "I'll break it down. Let me in." "Go away, Billy!" Abigail yelled, her voice echoing violently up the shaft. "You can't get in. The hatch is solid steel reinforced from the inside. Go find shelter in the farmhouse. The farmhouse roof caved in a week ago." Billy screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You open this door, or I swear to God I'll find a way to smoke you out." Abigail felt a cold bead of sweat roll down her spine. The ventilation system. She had hidden the intake pipe, well disguising it as an old exhaust stack on the side of the barn. But if Billy found it, if he blocked it or poured something down it, she would suffocate in hours. The banging stopped again. The silence that followed was thick and menacing. "All right, Abby," Billy yelled, his tone shifting from pleading to a dark, jagged malice. "You want to play it like this? I know this farm better than you do. I helped your dead husband lay the pipes. You just sealed your own tomb." Footsteps receded above her, heavy boots crunching against the concrete floor of the barn. Abigail descended the ladder quickly, her mind racing. She rushed to the environmental control panel. The air intake fan was humming smoothly. She had a manual override to shut the external vents and switch to an internal chemical oxygen scrubber, but the scrubber only had enough chemical charge to last a week. She stood by the panel, her hand hovering over the red override button, waiting. Minutes ticked by. 5. 10. Suddenly the air inside the bunker changed. The smell hit her first, acrid, sharp, and suffocating. It wasn't smoke. It smelled like raw diesel fuel. Billy had found the intake vent. He wasn't trying to smoke her out. He was trying to poison her. Abigail slammed her hand down on the red override button. The heavy blast valves in the ventilation shafts slammed shut with a concussive bang, cutting off the outside air. The main fans whined down into silence, replaced by the low, strained hum of the internal scrubber activating. She fell back against the wall, coughing, her eyes watering from the fumes that had already made it into the room. She was safe for the moment, but she had just initiated a deadly countdown. She was sealed in a concrete box 40 feet underground, with a finite supply of breathable air, while a desperate killer roamed the frozen surface above, waiting for her to die. The real survival hadn't started when the snow fell. It started right now. The lithium hydroxide scrubber hummed with a low, agonizing pitch. To Abigail, it sounded like the grinding gears of a giant clock counting down the exact minutes she had left to live. The digital display on the control unit glowed an unforgiving amber life support, internal, 164 hours remaining, less than 7 days. The air inside the bunker was already changing. The scrubber removed the carbon dioxide, but the lack of fresh oxygen exchange made the atmosphere feel heavy and sterile, like breathing inside a plastic bag. She sat on the edge of her cot, the 12-gauge shotgun resting across her knees, staring at the reinforced steel hatch. Beyond the thick metal, the world was silent. Billy Thatcher had retreated after dumping the diesel down the intake, likely waiting for the fumes to do their lethal work. He didn't know she had military-grade blast valves. He didn't know she was still breathing. But Abigail knew she couldn't outwait him. If she opened the valves to vent the bunker, the remaining diesel fuel trapped in the pipe would flood the room with toxic vapor. If she left them closed, she would slowly asphyxiate when the chemical charge died. She stood up, her muscles stiff from adrenaline and cold dread. She needed a solution, and she needed it now. She moved to the metal shelving unit where she kept David's meticulously organized blueprints and journals. She dragged a heavy leather-bound ledger to the small folding table and spread out the architectural schematics of the bunker. David had been paranoid, but he had also been a brilliant structural thinker. He wouldn't have designed a closed system without a redundancy. Abigail traced the blue and white lines with a trembling finger, her eyes scanning the complex web of wiring, support beams, and plumbing. Her finger stopped on a faint dotted line leading away from the primary water source, the Sandpoint well. When they installed the well, they drove a 2-inch galvanized steel pipe 30 feet below the bunker's floor, tapping into the Bitter Creek aquifer. But David had drawn a secondary perpendicular pipe branching off the main casing just below the concrete foundation. He had labeled it Emergency Flue/Barometric Siphon. Abigail flipped frantically through the journal pages looking for the corresponding date. She found it scrawled in David's frantic handwriting. If primary ventilation is compromised by snowpack or hostile action, the aquifer's natural cavern system maintains a constant barometric pressure and ambient air supply. By bypassing the water pump and tapping the upper casing, it is possible to siphon breathable air through the porous limestone strata. It won't be clean, and it will smell of sulfur, but it will support one pair of lungs indefinitely. She dropped the journal and scrambled toward the mechanical corner of the bunker. The well pipe emerged from the concrete floor, connected to an electric jet pump and a pressure tank. About 4 feet up, there was a heavy iron T-junction capped off with a rusted hex nut. David had actually built it. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her chest. She grabbed her toolbox, pulling out a heavy pipe wrench and a can of penetrating oil. She sprayed the rusted threads of the hex nut and locked the wrench onto the fitting. She pulled with all her might. The wrench slipped, sending her crashing onto the concrete floor, her knuckles scraping against the rough cinder block wall. She gasped, the pain hot and blinding. Above her, the rhythmic, heavy thumping began again. Thump, thump, thump. Billy was back. And this time, he wasn't just checking to see if she was dead. The sound changed from the hollow strike of a hammer to a sharp, aggressive tearing noise, metal groaning against metal. Abigail scrambled to her feet, ignoring the blood dripping from her knuckles. She wrapped a rag around the wrench handle for better grip, locked it back onto the hex nut, and threw her entire body weight against the tool. With an ear-splitting crack, the rust seal broke. The nut gave way. As she unscrewed the cap, a rush of cold, damp air blasted her in the face. It smelled deeply of wet earth iron and ancient stone. It was the smell of a grave, but to Abigail it was the sweetest perfume she had ever encountered. It was oxygen. She quickly grabbed a roll of duct tape and a spare piece of flexible PVC tubing, rigging a makeshift snorkel from the T-junction directly to the intake port of the chemical scrubber. She manually bypassed the lithium hydroxide canister, allowing the machine's fans to draw the subterranean air directly into the room. The digital display blinked rapidly, confused by the new input, before the amber warning light faded to a steady, cool green. She had air, but the victory was short-lived. A sudden, terrifying shower of sparks cascaded down from the ceiling directly above the steel hatch, followed by a hissing, roaring sound that made Abigail's blood run cold. Billy had found the acetylene torch. The temperature directly beneath the hatch began to rise within minutes. Billy was systematically cutting through the heavy steel hinges. Abigail backed away, staring up at the trap door. The center of the steel plate was beginning to glow a dull, angry cherry red. He was relentless. In a survival scenario, starvation strips a man of his humanity in a matter of days. Billy Thatcher, already a bitter and vindictive man, had been reduced to an animal. He knew there was food, warmth, and safety beneath the concrete, and he was willing to burn his way through to get it. "Abigail!" Billy's voice roared, barely audible over the roaring hiss of the cutting torch. "I can smell the rubber burning, the seals are melting. You're done." He was right. The airtight neoprene seal around the hatch frame was beginning to liquefy, dripping down the concrete shaft like thick black tears. Acrid smoke began to filter into the bunker, mixing with the damp cave air. She looked at the shotgun. She could wait for him to cut through, aim upward, and fire the moment the hatch fell open. But it was a terrible tactical position. She was 40 feet down a narrow shaft. He would have the high ground. He could simply drop a piece of heavy machinery, a burning rag, or a can of gasoline down the hole, and she would be helpless. She had to stop him before he breached the door. Abigail paced the length of the bunker, her mind racing, filtering through every piece of equipment, every tool, every chemical she had stored. Her eyes landed on the primary ventilation override panel and then shifted to the thick yellow PVC intake pipe that ran up the wall and disappeared into the ceiling. The pipe Billy had poured diesel fuel into. The heavy blast valve was sealed shut, isolating the bunker from the poison pipe. That meant there were 50 vertical feet of PVC piping, heavily saturated with raw diesel fuel, trapped between her valve and the surface. David's journals contained extensive notes on combustion pressure and atmospheric physics. Diesel fuel, unlike gasoline, is difficult to ignite with a simple spark. It requires compression or an open, sustained flame to reach its flash point. But once it vaporizes in a confined space, it becomes highly volatile. Abigail ran to the storage racks and grabbed a handheld propane blowtorch, the kind used for soldering copper pipes. She then grabbed a heavy fire-retardant welding blanket and a roll of heavy-duty aluminum foil. She dragged a stepladder to the ventilation array. She needed to create a backdraft. If she opened the blast valve just enough to introduce a flame, the sudden oxygen rush combined with the trapped diesel vapors in the confined space of the pipe should create a violent deflagration, a directional explosion that would shoot straight up the pipe and out of the intake vent on the side of the barn. It was an incredible risk. If the pipe ruptured inside the bunker, she would be burned alive. She wrapped her face and arms in the welding blanket, leaving only her eyes exposed. She ignited the small propane torch, adjusting the valve until a tight blue flame hissed from the brass nozzle. Above her, a heavy clank echoed down the shaft. One of the primary hinges had given way. One more, Abby. Billy screamed, his voice raw and ragged. One more hinge, and I'm coming down. You better have a hot meal waiting. She positioned the blowtorch directly beneath the mechanical release lever of the blast valve. She took a deep breath of the damp cave-scented air, bracing herself against the concrete wall. God, David, I hope your math was right, she whispered. She slammed the override lever upward, opening the blast valve a fraction of an inch. Instantly, a heavy, suffocating wave of diesel vapor poured down into the room. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the nozzle of the blowtorch directly into the cracked opening of the valve. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the physics of confined vapor combustion took over. There was no cinematic boom. It was a concussive, terrifying thwump that sucked the air out of Abigail's lungs and popped her eardrums. A jet of pure blue-white fire shot back down from the valve, singeing her eyebrows through the narrow gap in the welding blanket. The pressure wave slammed into the pipe. The heavy PVC shuddered violently, straining against its steel mounting brackets. The fire raced upward at supersonic speed, consuming the vaporized diesel in the 50-foot vertical shaft. Above ground, the result was catastrophic. The primary intake vent, disguised as a metal exhaust stack on the side of the barn, acted like the barrel of a cannon. The explosion tore out of the vent with the force of a military mortar. The shock wave ripped through the side of the wooden barn, shattering the heavy timber supports and instantly igniting the dry, ancient hay stored in the upper loft. Inside the bunker, Abigail was thrown backward off the ladder, crashing into the metal supply shelves. Canned goods rained down around her in a chaotic clatter. She lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. The cutting torch above had stopped. There was a moment of profound, eerie silence. Abigail rolled onto her side, looking up at the hatch. The red-hot glow of the steel was still there, but the tearing metal sound was gone. Then, the earth itself began to scream. The explosion hadn't just destroyed the side of the barn, it had structurally compromised the entire building. The massive 60 by 80-foot structure was already bearing hundreds of tons of compacted snow and ice from the relentless blizzard of the White Casket. The blast wave shattered the load-bearing columns on the eastern wall. Abigail felt the vibration before she heard the sound. It started as a deep rumbling tremor in the concrete floor, traveling up through her boots and into her teeth. "No," she breathed, crawling frantically away from the center of the room. "No, no, no." The barn above collapsed. The sound was apocalyptic. It was the roar of thousands of pounds of rotting timber, corrugated steel roofing heavy machinery, and solid ice crashing down onto the earth directly above the bunker. The sheer kinetic force of the impact registered like a localized earthquake. The concrete ceiling of the bunker groaned. Fine powdery gray dust rained down from the structural seams. The heavy steel support columns in the center of the room shrieked, bowing slightly under the sudden massive transfer of weight. The overhead LED lights flickered, violently, died for 3 terrifying seconds, and then snapped back on casting harsh, swinging shadows across the room. Abigail huddled in the corner, her hands clamped over her ears, waiting for the ceiling to cave in. She waited for the earth to swallow her. She closed her eyes, preparing for the crushing blackness, but the concrete held. David's paranoid engineering, the foot-thick reinforced foundation, the steel I-beams they absorbed, the catastrophic shock. The rumbling slowly faded, replaced by the chaotic settling sounds of shifting rubble and settling ice. Abigail stayed on the floor for a long time, her chest heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp in her mouth. When she finally found the courage to stand, she shone a flashlight up the entry shaft. The steel hatch was severely warped. The impact from above had driven the center of the door downward, buckling the heavy locking mechanisms. But more terrifying than the warped steel was what lay beyond the gap where the hinge used to be. She could see the undercarriage of the old broken-down riding mower, twisted and mangled, crushed directly against the top of the hatch. Beyond that, a solid, impenetrable wall of shattered timber and black soil. Billy Thatcher was dead, crushed beneath the weight of the collapsing structure or incinerated in the blast. He was no longer a threat. but Abigail was entombed. The entrance was completely blocked by thousands of pounds of debris. Even if she could somehow force the warped hatch open, she could never dig her way through the collapsed barn and the 15 feet of frozen earth above it. She walked over to the environmental panel. The gauges were erratic. The explosion had shattered the upper sections of the PVC ventilation pipes. The primary air system was permanently dead. She looked at the rusted T-junction on the well pipe. The makeshift snorkel was still drawing a faint, steady stream of damp, cave-scented air from the limestone aquifer below. It was enough to keep her alive. It was enough to keep her breathing. But as Abigail Caldwell sat back down on her cot, surrounded by years' worth of food, water, and heat, a new, much darker reality settled over her. The blizzard above would eventually end. The spring thaw would eventually come. But no one knew she was down here. Richard Klein thought she had sold her supplies. The town thought she was a grieving widow living in a drafty farmhouse. She had built a fortress to survive the end of the world, and she had succeeded perfectly. She was safe. She was warm. She was entirely alone, buried alive in a steel coffin beneath the Wyoming plains. She picked up the chalk, walked over to the concrete wall, and with a trembling hand drew a single clean line. Day 29. Time in absolute darkness does not flow. It pools and stagnates. By day 45, the chalk marks on the cold cinder block wall had ceased to represent the passage of the sun, and instead became a desperate tether to human sanity. Abigail Caldwell existed in a void of sensory deprivation suspended 40 feet beneath the frozen crust of Oglala County. The world above was a theoretical concept. Her reality was limited to 800 square feet of damp concrete, the faint, sulfurous draft of the aquifer, and the omnipresent, terrifying silence. The psychological degradation was slow but relentless. Without the natural circadian rhythms dictated by sunlight, her sleep cycle fractured into jagged, unpredictable intervals. She would wake up shivering on her military cot, disoriented, unsure if she had slept for 10 minutes or 10 hours. She began to speak aloud just to prove she still existed, reciting recipes, historical dates, and passages from her late husband's technical manuals. Survival logistics shifted from a sprint to a grueling, agonizing marathon. Her primary concern was temperature control. The twin 100-pound propane cylinders that fueled her catalytic heater were not infinite. To conserve fuel, she lowered the ambient thermostat setting to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. She lived wrapped in 2 heavy foil-lined emergency blankets and a down sleeping bag, her breath pluming in the dim light of the single LED bulb she allowed herself to keep illuminated. But the most insidious enemy was the moisture. The barometric siphon, the rusted T-junction tapping into the subterranean aquifer, was her only source of breathable oxygen. However, the air drawn from the deep limestone caverns was saturated with ground moisture. With the bunker's temperature hovering just above freezing, that moisture condensed instantly upon hitting the cold concrete walls. The shelter began to weep. Water pooled on the floor, soaking the bottom edges of cardboard supply boxes. Black mold, thick and aggressive, bloomed across the ceiling like dark, fuzzy star maps. Abigail spent hours every day wiping down the walls with rags, soaked in a diluted bleach solution, her hands raw and cracked from the harsh chemicals and the bitter cold. The smell of the bunker was a nauseating cocktail of damp earth, industrial bleach, unwashed clothing, and metallic canned food. By day 82 Tharn, February gave way to March on the surface, though Abigail had no way of knowing. Her physical form was deteriorating. The diet of sodium-heavy MREs and canned beans combined with extreme vitamin D deficiency left her skin a translucent, sickly gray. Her muscles, despite her daily attempts at isometric exercises, were atrophying. Her joints ached with a deep throbbing pain that made climbing the steel ladder to inspect the warped hatch an agonizing ordeal. During the deepest hours of her despair, the ghosts came. The hallucinations started as auditory anomalies, the sound of footsteps pacing directly above the concrete ceiling, or the low, familiar timbre of David's voice, discussing atmospheric pressure. Soon, they became visual. She would see her late husband standing by the water filtration system, holding his legal pads, shaking his head in disappointment. "You didn't factor in the hydrostatic pressure," Abby Twait, the phantom of David, whispered one evening, as she huddled under her blankets, shivering uncontrollably. "You reinforced the roof for the weight of the snow, but what happens when the snow turns to water?" She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands against her ears until they bruised. "You're not real. You're dead. Leave me alone." The water table, Abigail. The hallucination persisted, pointing a translucent finger toward the mechanical corner of the room. "The aquifer isn't static." Abigail opened her eyes, gasping. The hallucination was gone, but a new, very real, very terrifying sound had replaced it. It was a low, gurgling hiss. She threw off the sleeping bag, grabbing her flashlight, her bare feet hitting the freezing, wet concrete. She stumbled toward the mechanical corner, aiming the beam at the rusted T-junction of the well pipe. The pipe was vibrating. For nearly 3 months it had provided a steady, quiet draft of air. Now it was spitting wet, heavy globs of gray mud onto the floor. The hissing sound grew louder, transforming into a wet, aggressive sputtering. The spring thaw had begun on the surface. Millions of tons of snow and ice were melting across the Wyoming plains, supersaturating the soil and creating immense hydrostatic pressure. The water level in the Bitter Creek aquifer was rising rapidly, violently pushing the trapped cavern air up through the pipe, and the water was right behind it. April 14th arrived above ground with a blinding, triumphant sun. The National Guard, under the command of Captain Lawrence Reynolds, had finally managed to carve a path down Highway 9, leading a convoy of heavy machinery to dig out the isolated farming communities of Oglala County. The devastation was biblical. Entire herds of cattle lay dead and bloated in the thawing fields. Roofs were collapsed, power lines snapped like dry twigs, and the town of Bitter Creek was barely recognizable beneath the receding mountains of dirty, blackened snow. In the passenger seat of a mud-splattered county sheriff's Ford Expedition sat Martha Caldwell, David's older sister. She had flown in from Denver the moment Denver International Airport reopened, renting a car and bullying her way through state trooper barricades until she found Deputy Carter Hayes in Bitter Creek. Martha was a formidable woman, a corporate litigator who shared her late brother's stubborn, relentless DNA. "Vrit, bah, here. The farm is just another 2 miles. Deputy Hayes said, his voice exhausted, his eyes bloodshot behind aviator sunglasses. "But Mrs. Caldwell, Martha, you need to prepare yourself. We did aerial surveys last week. The main house took severe structural damage, and the barn is gone, completely leveled. Abigail wouldn't have stayed in the house if the roof was compromised," Martha stated firmly, clutching her leather handbag. She was resourceful, too resourceful for her own good sometimes. "With all due respect, ma'am, resourceful doesn't stop -50 degrees. We've pulled 32 bodies out of Bitter Creek so far. People who had fireplaces and pantries full of food. They turned onto the gravel driveway, the tires spinning in the thick, treacherous mud." When the farm came into view, Martha let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. It was a wasteland. The 2-story farmhouse had been sheared in half by a massive oak tree that had snapped under the weight of the ice. But the true horror was the site of the barn. It was a massive, chaotic crater of shattered red timber, twisted corrugated tin, and deep blackened mud. The explosion from the diesel backdraft had blown the walls outward, and the roof had pancaked directly into the center of the foundation. "I'm sorry," Hayes murmured, putting the truck in park. Martha didn't wait. She shoved the door open and stepped out into the ankle-deep mud, walking toward the ruins. Something felt wrong. The destruction was catastrophic, but there were anomalies. Among the rotted wood, she saw a piece of heavy steel I-beam. She saw industrial-grade cinder blocks that didn't belong in an agricultural structure built in the 1950s. "Deputy," Martha called out, her voice cutting through the wind. "Come here." Hayes trudged over. Martha pointed to a heavy yellow PVC pipe sticking out of the mud at a sharp angle. Its edges were blackened and melted. "Since when does a barn need a 10-inch industrial ventilation pipe?" Martha asked, her eyes narrowing. She stepped further into the debris, navigating the treacherous footing. She stopped near the center of the collapsed structure. The ground here was completely solid. It didn't give way like the surrounding mud. She scraped at the mud with the toe of her boot. Metal scraped back. "Get a shovel from your truck," Martha demanded, her voice trembling slightly. 40 feet below, Abigail Caldwell was fighting a losing battle against the earth. The gurgling from the well pipe had erupted into a violent geyser. Freezing muddy water shot out of the T-junction under immense pressure, hitting the far wall of the bunker and immediately flooding the floor. Within minutes, the water was 3 inches deep and rising fast. Abigail was soaked to the bone, her body violently convulsing from the freezing temperature of the water. She knew exactly what was happening. The bunker was an airtight seal. If the water continued to pump in, it would eventually fill the entire concrete box, drowning her in the dark. She had to cap the pipe. She waded through the freezing water, grabbing the heavy iron hex nut and the pipe wrench. The force of the water shooting from the 2-inch opening was staggering. It struck her in the chest like a physical blow, knocking her backward into the flooded water. She screamed, coughing up muddy, sulfurous liquid, and forced herself back up. She wrapped her arms around the main vertical pipe, hugging it tightly with her legs to anchor herself. She jammed the hex nut against the opening, trying to align the threads, while the pressurized water blasted into her face, blinding her and filling her nose with silt. "Come on!" she shrieked, slamming her palm against the top of the nut. The threads caught. Just a fraction of a millimeter, but it was enough. She grabbed the heavy pipe wrench, locked the jaws onto the rusted iron, and pulled with every ounce of strength left in her emaciated body. The wrench groaned. The nut turned, 1 rotation, 2. The violent spray reduced to a heavy trickle, 3 more agonizing rotations, the muscles in her arms tearing, the tendons in her forearms burning like hot wire. The water stopped. Abigail collapsed backward into the 6 inches of standing water that now covered the bunker floor. She lay there shivering so violently her teeth chipped against each other. She had stopped the flooding. But as the silence reclaimed the room, the true horror of her action settled over her. She looked up at the capped pipe. Then she looked at the dead chemical scrubber on the wall. She had just permanently sealed her only source of oxygen. The bunker was now a perfect airtight coffin. She had precisely the amount of air currently trapped in the room. In an 800-square-foot space, 1 resting adult consumes the available oxygen and produces lethal levels of carbon dioxide in roughly 36 hours. The clock wasn't just ticking anymore. The final alarm had been set. Hour 12. The air inside the bunker was already growing heavy and sweet, the telltale sign of carbon dioxide accumulation. Hypercapnia was a cruel and deceptive killer. It didn't cause the agonizing sensation of suffocation immediately. Instead, it poisoned the brain, bringing on crushing lethargy, severe headaches, and eventually a peaceful, delirious unconsciousness. Abigail knew she couldn't sit and wait to fall asleep. The water on the floor had ruined most of her bottom-tier supplies, but her tools were intact. If she was going to die, she was going to die fighting the steel that trapped her, not quietly accepting the dark. She dragged an 8-ton hydraulic bottle jack from her mechanical supplies, wading through the freezing, shin-deep water. She positioned a heavy steel timber directly beneath the warped, buckled center of the steel hatch above. She stacked cinder blocks to create a stable base, placed the jack on top, and began to pump the heavy iron handle. Clank, clank, clank. The hydraulic piston extended, pushing the steel timber up against the hatch. The resistance was immense. She was trying to lift not just the 1/4-ton steel door, but the crushed machinery and thousands of pounds of compacted debris sitting on top of it. Clank, clank. The metal groaned. Dust showered down. Abigail's head throbbed with a sickening rhythmic pulse. Her vision blurred at the edges, tunneling inward. The CO2 was building faster than she calculated, exacerbated by her physical exertion. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening crack echoed through the shaft. The warped locking mechanisms on the hatch shattered under the hydraulic pressure. The hatch pushed upward, opening a jagged 3-inch gap along the frame. Instantly, a torrent of thick black mud, rotted wood, and freezing sludge poured through the gap, cascading down the shaft and hitting the water below with heavy splashes. The weight on top was too much. The jack hissed a seal blowing out under the impossible load, dropping the timber. The hatch slammed back down, wedging itself tightly against the bent frame. Abigail fell to her knees in the freezing water. The jack was broken. The hatch was buried under a mountain of debris. She had expended the last of her energy, and worse, she had burned through hours of precious oxygen in the attempt. She crawled over to her cot, pulling herself up onto the mattress to get out of the freezing water. She wrapped the wet, heavy blankets around her shoulders. The headache was blinding now. Colors began to bleed in the dim LED light. She looked at the chalk marks on the wall. They seemed to detach from the concrete, floating in the air like pale white insects. "David," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I'm tired." She closed her eyes. The heavy, sweet sleep began to pull her under. Above ground, the farm was a swarm of diesel smoke and shouting men. Martha Caldwell had refused to let Deputy Hayes leave. She had commandeered his radio, using her formidable corporate authority to bypass local protocols and directly contact the county engineering department. By noon, a massive yellow Caterpillar excavator operated by a veteran named Benjamin Cole was rolling down the driveway. "I don't know what you expect to find under there, ma'am," Benjamin yelled over the roar of the diesel engine, looking at the heavy steel plate Martha had uncovered. "If that's a storm cellar, the weight of the blast and the roof caving in would have crushed the supports." "Just lift it," Martha commanded, pointing at the tangled mess of the old riding mower sitting on top of the plate. Benjamin expertly maneuvered the excavator's hydraulic arm, bringing the heavy steel bucket down over the debris. With agonizing slowness, he clamped the thumb attachment over the crushed mower and a massive piece of barn timber. The machine roared, black smoke belching from its exhaust stack as it fought the suction of the deep mud. With a sickening tearing sound, the debris ripped free. Benjamin swung the arm away, dropping the debris into the field. He brought the bucket back carefully, scraping away the remaining layer of mud and rotted hay. The steel hatch, severely bent and scarred from Billy Thatcher's cutting torch, was finally exposed to the sun. Hayes jumped into the shallow crater, wiping the mud away from the edges. He saw the shattered locking mechanisms and the 3-inch gap Abigail had managed to create before her jack failed. "Hey!" Hayes yelled, pressing his face near the gap. "Is anyone down there, County Sheriff? Can anyone hear me?" "Silence! Get a pry bar!" Martha screamed, sliding down into the mud beside him. Hayes ran to his truck, returning with a 5-foot heavy iron crowbar. He jammed the wedged end into the gap, throwing his entire body weight against the bar. The steel groaned, but it wouldn't budge. It was wedged too tightly in the warped frame. "Qwerty, attach a chain!" Benjamin yelled from the cab of the excavator. He tossed a heavy towing chain down into the crater. Hayes looped the heavy iron chain through the broken handle of the hatch, securing it with a heavy carabiner. He scrambled out of the crater. "Pull it slow." Benjamin engaged the hydraulics. The chain pulled taut, lifting into the air, singing with immense tension. The excavator groaned. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The mud held. The warped steel held. Then, with an ear-splitting shriek of tearing metal, the hatch ripped violently from its concrete frame. The heavy steel door flew upward, dangling from the excavator bucket, exposing a perfectly square, pitch-black hole in the earth. A wave of warm, foul-smelling air, heavy with the stench of mold, bleach, and human decay, rushed out of the shaft. Hayes grabbed a high-powered tactical flashlight from his belt, clicking it on and shining the beam down into the abyss. The beam cut through 40 feet of swirling dust and humidity, illuminating the flooded concrete floor. He saw the military cot, and he saw the motionless figure slumped across it. "Call medical!" Hayes roared, abandoning protocol. He didn't wait for a rope or a harness. He threw his legs over the edge of the shaft, grabbed the cold steel ladder, and began a rapid, reckless descent into the bunker. He hit the freezing water at the bottom, his boots splashing loudly in the silent tomb. He waded to the cot, dropping his flashlight, letting it roll across the mattress. Abigail was ice cold. Her lips were blue. Her eyes closed, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. "Abigail, Mrs. Caldwell," Hayes yelled, shaking her by the shoulders. She didn't respond. He looked up at the square of brilliant blue sky 40 feet above. The fresh, crisp spring air was already flooding down the shaft, displacing the heavy carbon dioxide. "Send down a basket!" Hayes screamed up the shaft. "She's alive! Barely get the paramedics ready!" The next 48 hours were a blur of blinding lights, the smell of sterile hospital sheets, and the agonizing sting of intravenous needles. Abigail woke up in the intensive care unit of the regional medical center in Rapid City. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room felt like physical needles in her eyes. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff and painful. Martha was sitting in a chair beside the bed, asleep, holding a styrofoam cup of cold coffee. Abigail tried to speak, but her throat was raw, damaged by the dry air and the chemical fumes. She managed a weak, raspy cough. Martha's eyes snapped open. She sat up straight, a look of profound relief washing over her sharp features. She didn't say anything profound. She just reached out, taking Abigail's frail, bruised hand in hers, and squeezed it tightly. Weeks later, when the physical therapy began and the nightmares slowly receded, Abigail finally learned the full extent of the white casket. The storm had claimed over 400 lives across 3 states. The power grid had been crippled for 2 months. Oglala County had been the epicenter. She also learned about the remains found in the upper perimeter of the barn crater. Dental records confirmed it was Billy Thatcher. The coroner concluded he had likely been killed instantly by the concussive force of the barn's structural collapse, brought on by a localized explosion. The authorities assumed a propane heater in the barn had malfunctioned. Abigail never corrected them. Months later, when the snow was entirely gone and the summer sun baked the Wyoming plains, Abigail Caldwell stood at the end of her driveway. The farm was a ruin, a scar on the earth. The county had filled in the bunker with concrete, sealing the tomb forever to prevent sinkholes. She had nothing left but the clothes on her back, David's surviving journals, and the air in her lungs. But as she looked up at the vast, clear blue sky, she took a deep, unrestricted breath. She had built a shelter to survive the end of the world, and she had. If you found Abigail's harrowing tale of survival against impossible odds gripping, please hit the like button to help this story reach more people. Survival isn't just about the physical structures we build. It's about the unbreakable human spirit and the relentless will to keep breathing when the world goes dark. Don't forget to share this video with friends who love intense real-life survival drama. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of human resilience, catastrophic events, and the incredible engineering that saves lives. Stay safe, stay prepared, and we'll see you in the next story.